Master, I make mention of you. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, translated by James Haughton Woods. And since that state is not affected by the purpose of the self, it is called permanent. But at the beginning of the three states that are particularized, the fact that the self has a purpose is known to be the cause, and this purpose is known to act as purpose and as efficient cause. Hence, this state is called impermanent. But the aspects which conform themselves to all kinds of external aspects, dharma, neither cease to be nor come into being, but appear as if they had the properties of coming into existence and of passing out of existence by reason of the individual phenomena. The individual phenomenalized forms, past and yet to come. Going and coming, inseparably connected with the aspects. As, for example, we say, Devadatta is poor. Why? Because his cows are dying. Since his poverty is due to the dying of his cows and not to his loss of himself, the parallel, samadhi, to the going and coming of the phenomenalized forms as affecting the aspects, guna, applies sama. That is, which we can only say that it is resoluble into primary matter, as next in development to that which is irresoluble in a primary matter. Form therein, it becomes distinguished from it as its effect, since the order of this development of the mutations is not transgressed. Likewise, the six unparticularized forms, formed in that which we can only say it is resoluble into primary matter, becomes distinguished from it, because the order of mutations is fixed. Similarly, the elements and organs formed in those unparticularized forms becomes distinguished from them, as been already described. There is no other entity, tattva, beyond the particularized forms. But their mutation into external aspect and time variation and intensity are to be explained. Book 3, verse 13, later. This sutra is begun with the intent of determining the various forms of the aspects, guna, the objects of sight. The sutra begins with the words 19, the particularized, and ends with the words divisions. He mentions the particularized forms, which are evolved matter, vikara, of the unparticularized forms, which the latter are without the serene and cruel and infatuated characteristics, the evolved forms, not the forms evolving other entities, tattva. He describes the forms belonging to these entities in the words of these for air. The order of explanatory statement follows exactly the order of production. The organs of intelligence, Buddha, are particularized forms of the personality substance, ahamkara, which is characterized as having the feeling of personality, of which has sattva as its dominant aspect. But the organs of action are particularized forms of the personality substance, which has rajas as its dominant aspect, whereas the central manas, the essence of which is of both kinds, must be supposed to be that particularized form of the personality substance which has both kinds, that is rajas, sattva, as its dominant aspects. Remember the pillars representing the personality, 2 or 3 depending on your culture. And there is an inference on this point that the 5 fine elements have the thinking substance as their cause, because they are unparticularized forms, like the feeling of personality. Moreover, being unparticularized form is the same as being the cause of evolved matter, and both in the fine elements and the feeling of personality there is nothing particularized. After grouping them together, he enumerates the particularized forms in the words, these, of the aspects. He numbers the unparticularized forms also with the word six. He groups them together and sums them up with the word namely. Now the prior is particularized by the subsequent. So smell itself, together with the subsequent four, has five characteristics. Taste itself, together with the subsequent three, has four characteristics. Color itself, together with the subsequent two, has three characteristics. Touch itself, with the subsequent sound, has two characteristics. Sound has the characteristic of sound only. That's an interesting set of things there. But of what are these six unparticularized forms to the effect? In reply to this, he says, these of capable actions fulfilling a purpose, having existence, sattva is the abstract words, whatever action fulfilling a purpose there be, whether its characteristics be the discernment of the difference between the sattva and the self. It is all of it comprehended in the great thinking substance. By saying of whose beings, he shows what it really is, and denies it as nothing at all. Tucha. This is equivalent to saying that the first mutation of primary matter is a real thing, and not an appearance vivarta. That is which is prior to, which is nearer in time, is that which we can only say is the resoluble primary matter, the great substance, mahat tattva, remaining in the great being of which we can all say that it exists. These six unparticularized forms, since it is established that the effect pre-exists in its cause, experience or reach the limit of development. On the other hand, of these non-particularized, which have particularized forms, there are also the mutations of external aspect, dharma, out of time variation, out of intensity. It is this that is the limit of development, and that is the limit of mutation of these particularized forms. Having thus mentioned the order of growth, he describes the order of dissolution in the words, reversing the process of creation. Reversing the process of creation means becoming resolved, amana, into the primary matter. In other words, particularized forms are resolved into their own form, that is, become non-particularized, and they remain, are dissolved, nilia, in that same great being, the Ishvara, of which all we can say is that it exists. And then, even with that great being, these unparticularized forms revert to the unphenomenalized primary matter, called soluble, because in none else they are resolved. This same unphenomenalized primary matter is qualified by words, which has neither existence nor non-existence. Existence is that which is capable of acts, fulfilling a purpose of the self. Non-existence is worthlessness. Tuchata, as regards the purpose of the self, that is so described as having neither existence nor non-existence, which is beyond the range of both existence and non-existence. What he means to say is this: the state when sattva and rajas and tamas are in equipoise is never of use in fulfilling a purpose of the self, and so it is not existent. Neither does it have a worthless kind of existence like the sky lotus, and therefore it is also not non-existent. The objector says, this may be so. Still in the unphenomenalized state, there are the great thinking substance and other entities, insofar as these are identical with this unphenomenalized state. for there is no utter annihilation of the existent, or, if utterly annihilated, it cannot be made to grow again. For because one cannot make the non-existent grow, the great thinking substance and the other entities would really exist in the unphenomenalized state, and therefore might function as acts fulfilling the purpose of the self, and so the unphenomenalized state might be said to exist. Then how could you say that it has no existence? In reply to this, he says, from which both existence and non-existence have been removed. The non-existent is a cause which exists beyond any existing effect. Although, in the causal state, the effect does exist as potential being, Chakhyatmana, still, insofar as it does not fulfill its particular purpose, it is said to be non-existent. This cause does not, however, have an effect, worthless for the purpose of the self, like a hare's horns. Accordingly, he says, from the purpose of the self, from which non-existence has been removed, a cause which exists beyond an effect that is non-existent or worthless with regards to the purpose of the self. For if that were so, the effect would not be produced from this cause any more than the sky lotus would be produced from this cause. This is the point. He brings the topic of the reversal of creation, which has been described, to a close in the words, this of these. The word this points back to that which has been stated just prior to that which immediately precedes. The state beginning with that of which we can only say that it is resoluble into primary matter, since they are affected by a purpose of the self, are not permanent, whereas the state which is unresolvable into primary matter, since it is not affected by a purpose of the self, is permanent. He gives the reason for this in the words of the state unresolvable into primary matter. But why is the purpose of the self not a reason? In reply to this, he says, not of the state unresolvable. By the use of the object, Vasaya, the purpose of the self, in place of that which contains the objects, Vasayan, the unresolvable state, he partially describes the knowledge in the self of the state. What he means to say is this: for this being so, it should be known that the purpose of the self acts as a cause in the state unresolvable into primary matter, provided the state unresolvable into primary matter could produce nirvatayata, the enjoyment of objects, or discernment of the difference between the sattva and the self, either of which is a purpose of the self. Then, however, these two are produced, there can be no longer a state of equipoise, and therefore this unresolvable state is not known as a cause of the fact that the self has a purpose. And thus the fact that the self has a purpose is not the reason for this unresolvable state. He concludes with the words, that not. The word ete is used in the sense of therefore. He describes the impermanent state in the words of the three. In other words, that of which we can only say that it is unresolvable, the unparticularized and the particularized. Having shown what the divisions are, he tells what the aspects are in the words, but the aspects. He gives a simile in the words, just as devadatta. In case of increase or decrease of the cows, which are absolutely distinct from devadatta, is the reason for devadatta's increase or decrease. How much more in the parallel case of the growth or decline of the individual phenomenalized forms, which are not different in some respects, and different in other respects from the aspects guna. An objector asks, is then the order of production not fixed? No. As he says in the words, that of which we can only say that it is resoluble. For surely the seeds of Nyagroda tree, do not in a single day shoot forth the Nyagroda tree. That's an interesting sounding name. Nyagroda, with its dense mass of green leaves, which absorbed in its branches and twigs a multitude of fierce rays of the sun, but gradually through contact with the earth and water and warmth, they produce in succession sprout and leaves, and stalks and stems, and the rest, So here also an order of production must be accepted in that it is established by reasoning and by verbal communication. How are the elements and organs formed from unparticularized forms? In reply to this he says, as has already been described by us when explaining the first part of this very sutra, and if it be asked why, in this case of the particularized forms, there is no mutation into any other entity, he replies, no, the particularized forms. So it is true that when the particularized forms actually enter into mutations, and if that were so, would not one have to say that they are permanent? And reply to this, he says, but there. The object of sight has been explained. Now the sutra is introduced with the intent of determining what the seer as such is. 20. The seer, who is nothing but the power of seeing, although undefiled, chuda, looks upon the presented idea, who is nothing but the power of who is nothing but the power of seeing, means who is nothing but the power of seeing untouched by any qualifications. This self becomes conscious by reflection, pratisambedin, of the thinking substance. He is not homogeneous with the thinking substance, nor utterly heterogeneous. Why do we say that the self is not even heterogeneous to the thinking substance? Because the thinking substance is something that enters into mutations, inasmuch as an object is known or not known, according as the thinking substance has or has not changed in the form of the thing, and the fact that an external object, for instance, a cow or a water jar, is something known and sometimes not known, proves that the thinking substance is something which enters into mutations, whereas the fact that in the case of the self, its object is always known, proves that the self does not enter into mutations. Why do we say this? Because it is surely not possible for the thinking substance to be an object of the self, and at the same time to be something now comprehended as something again not comprehended by the self. Hence it is proved that the self always knows its object, and from this it follows the self does not enter into mutations. Moreover, the thinking substance exists for the sake of another, since it acts by combining causes, whereas the self exists for its own sake. Thus, continuing the argument, the thinking substance is a complex of the three aspects because it determines each thing, sarva artha, as consisting of one or another of the three aspects, that is, as pleasurable, or as painful, or as indifferent. And since it consists of the three aspects guna, it is inanimate. The self, on the other hand, is that which the latter beholds the aspects by being reflected in them. Hence it is not homogeneous with the thinking substance. Very well then, suppose the self to be heterogeneous. The thinking substance still is not utterly heterogeneous. Why do we say this? Because though pure in itself, the self beholds the presented ideas, that is to say, it beholds that mutation of matter which the thinking substance undergoes when it takes the form of an object, and which is the presented idea of thinking substance. Bauddha. Looking thus upon this change in the thinking substance, the self seems to be it, the thinking substance, although it really is not the thinking substance. And in this sense it has been said, for the power of the enjoyer enters not into mutation, nor unites with objects seeming to unite with the thing in mutation, the thinking substance. It conforms itself to the fluctuation which that thinking substance undergoes, and it is commonly termed a fluctuation of the thinking substance insofar as it resembles anukarama trataya, a fluctuation of thinking substance, that it has come under the influence upagraha of intelligence, chaitanya. The object of sight has been explained. Now this sutra is introduced with the intent of determining what the seer as such is. 20. The seer who is nothing but the seer who is nothing but seeing, although undefiled, looks upon the presented idea. He explains the sutra by the words nothing but the power of seeing. The qualifications are the properties. Untouched by these, in the way shows the import of the words nothing but, as an objector says, this may be true if the power of seeing is without all qualifications, and the various things from sound downwards would not be known. For the object of sight cannot be something out of contact with the seeing. In reply to this, he says, this self, the union samkranta of the consciousness, of the reflection of the self with the mirror of the thinking substance, is itself the self's consciousness by reflection in the thinking substance, and so the various things from sound downwards become connected with the thinking substance, which has been changed into the likeness, chaya, of the power of sight. In other words, they become objects of sight. The objector says this may be true. Still, why is not the unity, even in the strictest sense, of the thinking substance and of the self to be accepted? What is the use of changing it into the likeness of this self? In reply to this, he says, it is not homogeneous, but the thinking substance. In this case, it would be difficult for it to change into the likeness of the seer. In reply to this, he says, nor utterly heterogeneous. Of these two, he rejects the homogeneity in the words, not even homogeneous. The reason for this, he acts by saying, why? For the heterogeneity, he gives a reason, which itself contains a reason in the words, known or not known, because the thinking substance enters into mutations, which is heterogeneous. When, as we know, this thinking substance changes into the form of the various things from sound downwards, then the object having distinguishing characteristics of the various things from sound downwards becomes known to this thinking substance. But when not changed into the form of these things, the object does not become known to it. And so only occasionally it assumes the form of these things and enters into mutations. And the argument is of this kind. The thinking substance enters into mutations, since objects are sometimes known and sometimes not known by it, just as the organ of hearing and of other organs are sometimes active and sometimes not. And the self proves to be of different properties to this, because the middle term that is always known is contrary to this, and as he says, always known. The objector says, this may be so, but if the self always has its object known, then he could not be isolated. With this in mind, he asks, why do we say this? He gives the answer in the words, because surely not for the thinking substance, in the state of restriction and thinking substance may exist, and at the same time there may be no process of a perception by the self, and therefore it is in order to indicate the contradiction. It is said, an object to the self. So the first and Buddha cha has an accumulative force and makes the thinking substance an object, but the two remaining ands, the sayae cha and grahita cha, are to make the contradiction clear. The argument, however, is this. The self enters not into mutation, because objects are always known to it in the consciousness and emergent states. Whatever enters into mutation does not always have its objects known, just as the organ of hearing or of other organs. This is a negative instance of the middle term. Sada jinyat tave syat vat. He gives another instance of difference in properties in the words, moreover, for the sake of another. For the thinking substance, insofar as it fulfills the purpose of the self by combining with hindrances and karma and subconscious impressions and with objects and organs, is for the sake of another. The argument, moreover, is this. The thinking substance is for the sake of another, because it acts by combining causes, like a bed or a seat or an ointment. But the self is not like that. As he says, the self exists for its own sake. Everything serves the purpose of the self, but the self serves no other. This is the point. He gives yet another instance of differing in properties in the words, thus each thing. The thinking substance determines all things as being serene are cruel, are infatuated, when it mutates into their forms. And these three are mutations of the sattva and rajas and tamas aspects. Thus it is established that the thinking substance is the complex of the three aspects, and again the self is not like that. But as he says, the self, on the other hand, later beholds the aspects. It beholds them in that it's reflected in them, but it does not become mutated into their form. He brings the discussion to a close with the words, hence, very well then, suppose heterogeneous. But it is not utterly heterogeneous to the thinking substance. Why do we say this? Because though pure in itself, it looks upon the presented ideas, and that is so that is stated in these words, Book 1.4. At other times it takes the same form as the fluctuations of the mind stuff. And in this sense it has been said by Panchaka, for the power of the enjoyer enters not into mutation, the power, in other words, the self Atman, and therefore it does not unite with the thinking substance. Seeming to unite with the thinking substance, which is in mutation, it conforms itself to the fluctuation, which the thinking substance undergoes. An objector asks, if it does not unite, how is it that it seems to unite, or how does it conform itself to the thinking substance without assuming a fluctuation of its own? To this he replies with the words, and it. That thing has come under the influence of intelligence, whose form has been affected, uparakta, by intelligence. What he means to say is this: although the moon does not unite with the clear water, still it seems to unite with it, insofar as its reflection unites with the water. Similarly, in this case also, although the power of the intellect, chitta, does not unite with the thinking substance, still it seems to unite, since its reflection has united with it. Thus the power of intellect, changed into the essence of the thinking substance, conforms itself to the fluctuation which the thinking substance undergoes. In this way, the word beholding has been explained. It beholds it in the sense that it sees itself as resembling it. Now, the difference between the individual self and the God self, the created being and the non-created, the Quran and others have said that God, all is in God's vision, but God is not comprehended by anyone's vision. And so, as best as we're going to know God, we got to know ourselves, right? 21. The being, Atman, of the object of sight is only for the sake of it, the self. Since the object of sight is changed insofar as it becomes the object of the action of the self, who is so much Rupa Singh Dorje, the being Atman of the object of sight, that is to say, the object of sight itself, Svarupa, exists only for the sake of the self, but inasmuch as it is itself only so long as it has acquired its being as having the form of another, it is no longer seen by the self. When once it has accomplished the purpose of the self, of giving the self experience and liberation, so by escaping from itself it attains cessation, but it does not utterly cease to be. Having stated what the seer and the object of sight are, he says that the object of sight serves the purpose of the self, and this purpose is based on the relation characterized as being that of the proprietor and property. 21. This being of the object of sight is only for the sake of it. He explains the sutra in the words, who is so much Rupa Singh Dorje. Since the object of sight has become the object of action, karma rupata, that is, has been changed into the object of experience by the experiencer, that is the self, who inasmuch as seeing, and therefore the being of the object of sight must be only for the sake of the seer, but not for the sake of the object of sight. The objector asks, how can the being Atma in Durjatma be for the sake of this Atma in Tad Atma, that is the self? In reply to this he says, is itself. What he means to say is this: the object of experience is the object of sight, as having pleasure or pain, and pleasure and pain, being co-agents or counter-agents, persist as such in tattvena only for this purpose of acting with or against the self. For the various things, from sound downwards, as objects of senses, are co-agents or counter-agents for the self only because they are identical with pleasure and pain, and it cannot be said that they exist to be coactive or to be counteractive to themselves, for that would be a contradiction of a fluctuation with itself. Therefore, by a process of elimination, it is the power of intellect, chitta, only for which they are coactive or counteractive. Consequently, the object of sight is for this self, and not for the object of sight itself, and therefore the object of sight is only for the sake of it, the self, not for the sake of the object of sight, because, yat, it is itself as long as the purpose of the self continues, and when the purpose of the self is complete, it is also completed. Accordingly, he says, but it itself. But the object of sight itself is inert, jada, yet it has acquired its being. That is, it is experience as having the form of another. That is the form of the soul, Atman. That is the intelligence, Chaitanya. When experience and liberation have been accomplished, it is no longer seen by the self. This was the kind of experience, the perception and the bhava of sound and other perceptible things. Liberation is the experience of anubhava, of the difference between sattva and the self. Both of these two kinds of things, experience and liberation, belong to the self only, who by reason of the fact that the likeness of the self becomes changed by the inert thinking substance, does know them both. And so, when experiences and liberation have been accomplished for the self, the subservience of the object of sight to the purpose of the self is finished. Hence, it is said, when once it is accomplished, the purpose of the self. Meanwhile, he raises an objection in the words, by escaping from itself. He rebukes this with the words, but it does not utterly seem to be. And, we got to figure out we got to self-realize and self-actualize. We got to find the personal aspects of our purpose. Why does it not utterly cease to be? 22. Though it has ceased to be seen in the case of one whose purpose is accomplished, it has not ceased to be, since it is common to others besides himself. And we're going to stop there. Probably pick this up tomorrow.